So we had said that we were going to review Red Moon Tide this week, but unfortunately that film has now gone off Mubi, so we weren't able to do it. Instead, we've reviewed the next one on the list, Lingui, The Sacred Bonds, the 2021 film by Mahamat-Saleh Haroun. So Joe, Lingui, The Sacred Bonds, what did you think?
In my notes, I started to list films that it reminded me of thematically. And as it happened on Saturday, I went to see Happening, which is the adaptation of the Annie Ernaux biography, set in France in the late 50s, about a young woman trying to find an abortion in a society in which it's outlawed. And I was also thinking about 4 months, 3 weeks and 2 days, that really outstanding Romanian film. And then a couple of years ago of that film, Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, which was similarly understated and dealt with really similar themes. And then, of course, in the last 24 hours, the sort of subject matter of this film has become kind of horribly relevant, in that it's a story of a young woman who has an unwanted pregnancy, but lives in a society in which her right to an abortion doesn't exist legally. And so what sort of lengths does she have to go to? And it's also a film about female relationships. And so although there are lots of films it's comparable to thematically, the filmmakers it reminded me of most persistently were actually the Dardenne brothers. The Dardenne brothers, when they're sort of at their best with films like late 90s, early 2000s, films like The Promise and The Child and The Son, which is one of my favorites. And the reason it reminded me of them was because at their best, they have a high moral seriousness and a really clear eye in a very simple and effective, but quite spare cinematic style. And there was a moment quite early on in this film where the camera tracks, starts in the doorway of the mosque and then tracks around to see the mother, Amina, sitting on her own outside on her prayer mat. And it doesn't linger, it keeps tracking as she stands up and takes her mat and walks away. But it's heartbreakingly done. It's, you know, beautifully simple and economical, and I found really effective. And it was that quality, that sort of clear-eyed compassion, compared with a really thoughtful simplicity and honesty in the style that reminded me of the Dardennes. I was really impressed with this film right from the beginning. The opening shot shows the mother with that tire, and she's cutting it up to make stoves out of the wiring. And it's ingenious and really hard work, and she's sweating, but the music is quite cheerful and light-hearted, and you learn a huge amount about her character in that sequence. There was also a bit where she's propositioned by the older man, and she is kind of hemmed in by him. And there are a couple of very, very neat edits where it cuts to one side of her and then in front of her. And in both shots, we can see him at different angles. So it's like he's pressing in against her. And so the film's symbolism and the way that's achieved through this really careful cinematic style, I found really effective. But then I started thinking, well, so what, right? Because anyone can do symbols in films. What makes some symbolism and some kind of cinematic language more effective than others? And I realized that when I talk about the Dardennes, really what I'm talking about is Bresson, because, you know, they are often considered sort of heirs to Bresson. And so I started to think, well, what is it then, in very simple terms, that I find so effective about Bresson? And on one level, it is that with sort of conventional cinema, you have an editorial style and use of music that keeps you kind of pinballing on the surface of the film, oftentimes in a really enjoyable way. And if you watch naturalistic performances, then the way we judge whether they are good or not is how closely they resemble real life. So we're always kind of scrutinizing them in terms of something they're not. And with Bresson, all of that stuff is stripped away. And what is left under the surface is this kind of unaccountable poetry, right? But it doesn't always work. And it reminded me of editing with prose, right? Because you can edit sentences and clean them right down to the bone. But if there is no essential animism there, if the prose was never alive to begin with, it doesn't matter how precise you make the language, it never comes to life. And with this film, it was clearly alive. There was something there. There was a poetry in this film that meant the spareness and simplicity of its style, which is by no means entirely unique. It's unusual, but it's not unique, was powerfully effective for me. There were moments like the girl's near drowning, and the moment where the mother later propositions herself for the money, and he says, "Are you not ashamed of yourself?" And it's heartbreaking. You know, it's beautifully done, and it's really hard to say why, because the performance is very quiet. The cinematic style is quite, as I say, spare and simple, deceptively simple. So it's got something, it's got some quality that is really difficult to account for. And then, of course, the plotting starts to reveal itself to be really neat and cleverly done when we find out why she's pregnant, how she became pregnant. And there is that almost unbearably tense sequence where she is running down the alleyway and the daughter's following, and then the violence, she attacks him. And I did not see that coming at all. I thought there was going to be something slightly more conventional and frankly, like enjoyable ending there, that they were going to kind of reconcile or decide that the violence wasn't necessary or something. But the film goes there. And in a film that is full of really audacious touches, I think the most audacious sort of stroke it takes is that it presents that ending in triumphant terms. It's like these women have triumphed in a domineering, overbearing society. And in a way they have, but there's something kind of thrillingly unnerving about that, because they've done so by, we don't know what happened to that guy. I mean, he might be dead. She could have killed him, and yet the film presents that in a bold kind of audaciously hopeful way. And so I was really thrilled by the film, completely taken off guard by it. I thought to begin with that it was, very careful and arresting, and as I say, reminded me of the Dardanelles and then later of the Bressons. And it wasn't till the end that it really sort of came to life in its own right. It's very much its own film, directed on its own terms, and I shall certainly find more by the filmmaker.
I really like what you said about the clear eye of this film, because one of the really outstanding things I found about this film was just how, it's beautifully photographed. So, obviously this is a film about a number of very traumatic experiences, but it is beautifully photographed. And as you said, there's an incredible poetry in the way that this film is made. And it's like, we're in a place which is really hot and dusty, and yet it doesn't feel like that. You compare it to the film we reviewed last week, Air Conditioner, you really had the feeling of being in a hot, uncomfortable place. Whereas this just felt beautiful, clean, clear. The colors in this film are just amazing. So even the scenes which in reality would be dusty just looked beautiful. This film is so kind of orange, yellow. And when the women wear orange clothes or headscarves, it's just stunning. And then suddenly one of them will wear a blue bit of clothing. And I thought the clothing in this film of the two main characters was just amazing. And it's just a beautiful kind of, it's lush in terms of the color and what's evoked poetically by this film. Now, all of that might sound strange when this is a film about rape and about female genital mutilation and about the oppression of women and about women, as you described, as heartbreaking. And I agree. And I watched this film with some trepidation because Mubi at the beginning put up a warning for, this film contains violence and sexual violence. And, I haven't got that strong a stomach for gratuitous violence. And so I didn't think this film would have gratuitous violence in, but I was, once we got into this film and you begin to realize the subjects, I was kind of expecting to see something really horrible. And it's amazing because I think this film gets the balance exactly right between being sensitive to the trauma that kind of underlies this film, and yet having this beautiful poetry in what you're looking at. And I think it works really well. The trauma is always under the surface, but there's something very beautiful at the surface. So that really struck me about this film. I mean, I found, heartbreaking is the right word. I found this film really disconcerting in terms of the themes, and really, really sad and difficult. But it's really interesting, that kind of contrast between, because it avoids showing us any of these traumas. They're all suggested. We're not actually present directly at the moment of any of these traumas. I mean, some, except in the loose sense of like some of the, like, as you say, when she's propositioned by that guy, that in itself is a traumatic experience. But in terms of the big traumas of this film, they all happen off camera. And for me, it worked really, really well. I think what I thought about was, I didn't know whether this film was made by a man or a woman. I didn't focus on the name beforehand. And, we always watch these films knowing very little about the films or the filmmakers. And as I watched it, I was trying to decide whether it was made by a man or a woman. And at the end, when I did look that it was made by a man, I'm really interested to know, because it's a male filmmaker and we're two males reviewing it. We really both got a lot from this film. I'd be really interested to hear what a female perspective on this film was, because actually the thing, there was something rather beautiful about this film, that sacred bond that existed between the women, almost like a sense of like an underground community almost, of people helping each other, that actually, there was an incredible strength in that, and the strength of the bond of shared trauma. I thought it was interesting, that depiction. I mean, it may have just happened a little bit too quickly and been a bit clumsy, but, rightly, she doesn't want to speak to her sister. She struggles with speaking with her sister. But as soon as she hears of her sister's trauma, it completely changes her. And they're able to after years of kind of separation, they're able to reconcile very quickly through this shared trauma. So the sacred bond is actually comes about through shared trauma. And I thought that was a really interesting, and beautiful thing. So amongst all this trauma, there's something beautiful happening about this supportive community of real love and kindness emerging. It felt like it worked to me, but I would be interested on a female perspective on it, to see whether, because obviously this is a male director representing this very subtle, beautiful bond between women. And I'm not saying a man couldn't do that, but you do wonder whether this film, it just makes me wonder whether if this film had been directed by a woman, whether it would have been the same. The one thing that I am not sure about in this film is why we needed to see the man being beaten. So although we didn't see any violence, and there was some horrible violence behind this, underneath the surface of this film, to the women. So we didn't see any of the violence to the women. But when there's violence to a man, we see that almost in its full glory. You know, I mean, it's definitely not gratuitous, but it's a pretty unpleasant scene where she, you know, bashes him up and possibly kills him. Although, as you say, we don't know, because he does stand up again. We see him stand up. I'm just not sure whether we needed to see that. I question why he showed us that, whether it was almost a bit of a crowd-pleasing event at the end. You know, it's like that was, it was almost too neat and tidy and too much of a happy ending. I'm not 100% sure, but I do ask that question. You know, everything, all the violence in this film was very subtly treated, and then suddenly we get this, and it jarred a little bit. But at the same time, the scene leading up to it, when they're running down those passages, and you don't know whether he's suddenly going to appear around the corner and, you know, and hurt them. It comes to a really good climax, the film. And yeah, I really thought it was an excellent film, actually. Yeah, highly recommended.
Yeah. I think you're right to emphasize the beauty of the film, and it is an interesting issue, isn't it? How do you make a beautiful film about really dark subject matter? And there's no one answer to that, is there? This is definitely an example of how you can do it, I think. And I suppose it's because one gets the sense from this film that there is, you know, that there is beauty in life. Life is exquisite, but it's also full of pain, and, as you say, trauma. And the one doesn't preclude the other, that they coexist. And there is a sensitivity in getting that balance right, isn't there, that this film certainly achieves. There is other violence in the film, actually. One of the other things that I wrote down that I found really shocking was the moment where she beats her daughter. And that's quite explicit and shocking, actually.
Oh, yeah.
And so I felt like all the way through, the film was certainly very unsentimental and frank about violence. I agree that a lot of the stuff that's happened by the time the film starts is obviously off screen, and we really don't need to see any of that. But I found that final attack on him thrilling in a really shocking kind of way. And as I said, I feel like that was sort of, in a way, in a perverse sort of way, its crowning achievement is how audaciously that's presented, because the film to that point is so, as I say, frank, but there is a delicacy to it, or at least a restraint to it. I did not expect such violence, and it's depicted like everything else in the film, quite briskly, or not briskly, but just like straightforwardly. It's not fussy, it's not salacious, but it happens right in front of you, and it's explicit, and it hurts, it's painful. But then I thought that was necessary to really make, as bold as it is, their confrontation with the camera at the end, as if to say, you know, we have triumphed, because it's not a triumphalist film the way you might imagine it would be when it sets out. You know, I imagine, given the title and the fact that it's about the relationship between mother and daughter, that the triumphalism might be some more conventional, sentimental or emotional reunion between them. Whereas in fact, it's a celebration almost of quite extreme violence. You know, we won over the men. And I think that's actually a bracingly provocative way to conclude the film. And I found it really affecting, actually.
Yes, I take that point, because actually, when you look at the development of her character, she kind of rebels. I mean, she's all, you know, you get the sense that, and the sister makes reference to that she's always had a personality. She's always had some agency, and that led to her being excluded from her family. But, you know, still she lived oppressed in this system. But you get the sense of her, with her starting to smoke, with her, you know, going out without the scarf on, with her, you know, refusing to go to the mosque, with her dancing with the daughter. You know, it's like you get the sense of her kind of stepping into a more powerful position. You know, she found more agency, she found more power, and maybe that's the the kind of conclusion of that she hits back in the only way that she could, because the law wouldn't help her, the police wouldn't help her. That's the only way that she can kind of hit back for this terrible thing that he's done. You know, I mean, I'm against all violence because I'm a pacifist. So I guess that makes me slightly uncomfortable in saying this, but he deserved something. He deserved some punishment. And maybe it is, in terms of what you're saying, maybe there is this trajectory of her finding some freedom in that oppressed society. And the beauty, as you say, the beauty of people coming together in trauma, but still finding community and a deep meaning to life. You know, that it's nice, isn't it? The sacred bonds. It's not just a bond, it's a sacred bond. It's a really deep, meaningful bond. So yeah, I can see, I can go along with that ending works very well in the context of the film.
Yeah, but no less troubling for that. You know, I found it a troubling ending, you know, that they celebrate the violence almost. You know, it's not an easy thing to, but that was what made it so striking, I think. The other thing I was thinking when you were talking there was, I suddenly thought of Matisse when you were describing the colors. You know, there is something of Matisse in it, isn't there? There's almost blocks of color in the film that are put together in a way that is really effective, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really photographed in an interesting way. Many of the images are really compelling, and if you made them as stills and, you know, displayed them in a gallery, they'd look incredible. You know, sometimes I did actually stop it a couple of times just to appreciate the color and the composition, and, you know, as it's really, really well made. One thing that happened for me, I mean, you made reference to it being particularly significant in the last 24 hours, and I assume you were referring to the Roe versus Wade issue in the US and the likelihood, the seeming likelihood that ruling may be reversed. I agree that watching this film in the last 24 hours and seeing that news coming through has really raised these issues for me. They've been on my mind a lot today. I'm troubled by those issues today. And, you know, I think that's where this film was really effective, because despite the fact that it's got this beautiful poetry, this beautiful cinematography in it, this beauty of the bond between these women, this community, it still is serving the purpose of highlighting these horrible issues which we all need to be aware of. So I think, you know, that's where the film is a great success for me, that it's left me thinking about those issues.
Yeah, agreed.
Good. So we both recommend this film.
Highly recommended. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's next?
Next up is Drive My Car by Ryosuke Hamaguchi.
Looking forward to it.